I was called for a test, simply a silent test, just to see how the two of us in costume would look together. And that's when I first met him. And I walked onto the set, and they said, "Would you please stand next to Mr. Flynn?" And I saw him. Oh my. Struck dumb. And I knew it was what the French call a coup de foudre. And so I took my position next to him, and I was very, very formal with him, because that's the way you were in those days. We had never met, and we just stood there next to each other. Oh, well, then a few weeks later, after quite a considerable debate had gone on, Betty Davis, for example, had been photographed with him too. She was the great star on the lot. They had to weigh casting me as Arabella Bishop, because we were both at that time completely unknown. And they were going to invest what was then a very large sum of money, $800,000, in this production. Therefore, they decided that we should work on some scenes together, not to be filmed, but just so that the producer and director could come once we had perfected the scene, come down on a stage and just see how we performed together. So one day we were called together, and we started to rehearse, and then we had a lunch break, and we went off to the commissary, and he walked with me to the commissary. I'd never been in it before, and I got a tray, and he went ahead and he took his tray to a table, and I filled my tray, and I thought, oh, I want to go and sit over there next to him. I thought, no, he'll think I'm bold, and I can't do that. So I found another place and sat there and ate my lunch in a solitary fashion. But when I turned in my tray, he turned his in at the same time. So that meant that we walked back to the stage together. And when we got there, no one was there. We were the first. And we sat down on the ramp, which leads from the great open door of the stage to the street. And he asked me, 25 years of age when this happened, and I was still 18. He said to me, "What do you want out of life?" And I thought, what an extraordinary question to be asked. Nobody's asked me that, ever. And, in fact, nobody ever did in the years that followed. And I said, I would like respect for difficult work well done. And then I said, well, what do you want out of life? And he said, I want success. And what he meant by that was fame and riches, both of which he certainly did achieve. But when he said it, I thought, but that's not enough. And indeed, it proved in Errol's life not to be enough. Well, and then, of course, they decided to cast us together, and we made the film. The life of the love interest is really pretty boring. The objective is the marriage bed. That's what the heroine is there for. And will he win or will he not? Will they finally make the marriage bed? It was obvious that it would be the marriage bed, not any other bed. But it was all about, would they in the end get together that way? And the route to the marriage bed, and that was promised at the end of the film, of course, was a pretty boring route. The heroine, she really had nothing much to do except encourage the hero, and at the right moment. And you can't imagine how uninteresting that can be. The route. The objective might have been different, but anyhow, the route is very boring. So I longed to play a character who initiated things, who experienced important things, who expressed, who interpreted the great agonies and joys of human experience. And I certainly wasn't doing that on any kind of level of significance, playing the love interest. One day, I came back from location in Modesto, it was, Dodge City. It must have been early December, very late November in any case, but early of 1938. And the phone rang. A voice said, "You don't know me, we've never met, but I am George Cukor. I've been supervising the preparation of Gone with the Wind, and I will be directing the movie. We are in the process of casting, and I would like to know if you would be interested in playing the role of Melanie." Well, I said, I certainly would. And then he said, would you consent to doing something highly illegal? Well, I said, what would that be? And he said, "You're under contract to Warner Brothers. We have no right to ask this of you, but would you come secretly, tell no one, to the studio? We'll give you directions to what entrance to go, which is a private entrance. Someone will be waiting there for you, and they will unlock the door and let you in and lead you to my office to read some lines. Read the part of Melanie." I said, yes, I'd be delighted to do this highly illegal thing. So I did. And I read the lines for George Cukor, and he said, "I think I must call David." And he called David Selznick and said, "David, I think you must hear Miss De Havilland read the part of Melanie." So it was all arranged that I would go up to David's house, which happened to be a southern mansion, by the way, up to his house on Sunday at 3 o'clock. Having memorized a scene which George then gave me, a scene between Scarlett and Melanie. And so on Sunday, I drove myself up my little green Buick to George's southern mansion, David's southern mansion. I was shown into this beautiful drawing room, wood panel, lovely room. And in came George and David. Now, I have to explain to you that George was very, very rotund. He also had very dark eyes and very dark hair, very, very curly and very thick. And he wore very thick glasses, thickly rimmed, dark tortoiseshell, very dark, or maybe not even tortoiseshell. They were rimmed in thick black rims. He played Scarlet. He played Scarlet passionately, clutching the portieres. There we were in this little bay window with the hangings, and I was pleading with Scarlet, Scarlet, over something or other, and he was clutching the portieres. And there was David standing 3 feet from us watching this scene with rapt attention, enthralled. Well, part of my mind, of course, was saying this has to be the most comic thing to witness that has ever happened, ever been performed in the history of the world. Now, extraordinarily, when this was over, David decided that he had found his Melanie. But before making a final decision, he wanted to see the screen test. Couldn't make a screen test with me, of course. A screen test of the other ladies who had tried out for the part. So I went into the projection room, and there was Mrs. Selznick, Irene, wonderful, wonderful woman, sitting in a taffeta housecoat in this empty projection room, which abutted on the drawing room. We all sat down, and the projectionists began to run the different tests. Andrea Leeds was marvelous. Anne Shirley was marvelous. There were at least 6. I thought they were all wonderful, and I said so. And then I thought, oh, Lord, I don't want to convince him. I don't want to convince David and George to choose one of them. I must be more restrained in my reaction. So I sort of calmed down and was much more discreet. And when it was over, unbelievably, David said, well, I'll start getting in touch with Jack Warner. So I had survived the acid test of the 6 screen tests. Now, Jack Warner utterly refused to lend me for Melanie. He wouldn't hear of it. I even went to call on him and begged him. He said no, he wouldn't do it. He would not lend me to Selznick to play the part of Melanie. I was desperate, and I did something, age 22, that really was not correct, but I did it. I called Mrs. Warner, who had been an actress, lovely, lovely woman. Anne Alvarado was her name before she married Jack. And I told her that I would very much like to see her, and would she be kind enough to have tea with me at the Brown Derby. And she said yes. Well, we met. It was raining. I remember that. The Brown Derby, I think, no longer exists. Terrible thing that they tore that down. And I explained to her how much the part meant to me. And I said, would you help me? She said, I understand you, and I will help you. And it was through her that Jack eventually agreed. And he says so in his biography. It was Anne who did it. Isn't this wonderful? And finally, arrangements were made, an agreement between Selznick and Warner, and Selznick had a one-picture commitment with Jimmy Stewart, so he gave that over to Jack Warner, who needed him for a film, and took me in exchange. And so I reported to the set. The first day of shooting, I was not in the scene. It was that opening scene, war, 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 Scarlett's scene. And I thought I should go and wish everyone well and pay my respects to the whole crew on that first day. And I was there to play Melanie. The main thing is, people wondered, Jack, for example, said, "Oh, you don't want to play Melanie, you want to play Scarlett." I said, "I don't want to play Scarlett, I want to play Melanie." It's because so young, I had for 4 years been earning my own living, going through all the problems of a career woman, self-supporting, and even contributing to the sport of others, which is what Scarlett did. That's what Scarlett did. So I knew about being Scarlett in a sense. But Melanie was someone different. She had very deeply feminine qualities. Scarlett was a self-absorbed person. She had to be. Career women have to be. That's all there is to it. But Melanie was other people oriented. And she had these feminine qualities that I felt were very endangered at that time, and they are from generation to generation, and that somehow they should be kept alive. And one way I could contribute to their being kept alive was to play Melanie. And that's why I wanted to interpret her role. The main thing is that she was always thinking of the other person. And the interesting thing to me is that she was a happy person. Melanie wasn't. I mean, Scarlett. Scarlett was not a happy woman. All self-generated, but and preoccupied. But there's Melanie, all oriented, other people oriented, happy woman, loving, compassionate. She had this marvelous capacity to relate to people with whom she would normally have no relationship. For example, look at her behavior with Belle Watley. Absolutely astounding. Marvelous. Thrust into my profession without any training whatsoever. I had to just flounder, just find my way. It was an agonizing experience. It's like jumping off a diving board in the Olympic contest without knowing how to swim or dive. And I just had to find my way. So one day, I said to Jimmy Cagney, "Jimmy, what is acting?" And he said, "I don't know." He said, "All I can tell you is, whatever you say, mean it." And I thought that marvelous counsel. It is a key. Wonderful. Vivian was just a marvel. She was a hard worker, highly professional, a marvel. And between scenes, she had this other capacity. She it took a long time to light up the sets, as you could well imagine, Technicolor in those days, 3 cameras or 3 strips of film, 3-step cameras, and all of that required quite special lighting and a lot of time to set the scenes in that way. So Vivian, in between, would find a little quiet place on the set and she and Gable would play a game called Battleship. And occasionally they would invite me to join them, and I would play, and the assistant director would come and give us a warning. He would say 10 minutes, something like that, and I would excuse myself to go back to my dressing, not only check the makeup, but also try to recapture the character of Melanie, which often just looking in the mirror, because the costumes and the hair and all of that did express her so well, I would need that time. Not Vivian. She would leave, they would say, that we were ready to shoot, ready to rehearse, ready to shoot, and she would get up from the game of Battleship, go straight into the scene and play it brilliantly. She was fabulous, fabulous. 2 or 3 weeks after we had begun shooting, we learned that George Cukor would be leaving the film. It was devastating for Vivian and for me, because we had set our characters under his direction, and for consistency and continuity, we would depend on him and his assistance and direction. And the thought of going to having another director come on the set was devastating. So we went, the two of us, to implore David Selzner to retain George. We've been doing the bazaar scenes. We were both dressed widow's weeds, all of that. And we had black bordered handkerchiefs, and we went to see David. We called ahead and said we would like to see him, and he received us. And we pleaded for 3.5 hours. We pleaded that he retain George as director. We even took out our handkerchiefs, black bordered, and we wept into them. Well, he withstood those tears. He had a kind of window seat in a bed behind his desk, and he retreated to that window seat. He couldn't go out the window. That stopped him. But how he managed to remain firm, I'll never know. And he didn't dismiss us or anything. He was so patient. He listened and listened and listened. And finally we left, and we had not succeeded. Nobody really knows the story, but I think that that Clark was rather concerned that it might be because there was a scene, a bazaar between him and Scarlett and Melanie, and that scene was written quite differently from the scene that we saw, and quite differently. And Melanie had an extraordinary speech, long speech, quite remarkable. And the whole incident of the exchange between Clark and Scarlett was somehow secondary to what happened between Scarlett and Melanie before he enters this scene. This is just supposition on my part. It's just a theory I have. He may have thought, oh, heavens, George is known, I've never worked with him before, and he may turn this into a woman's picture, because that scene really was between those two women and about the war, and it was only incidental, this little incident it was very early in the shooting. I sort of think that might have been it, because we went back and we reshot the scene, and that long speech of Melanie's was out, and the whole emphasis of the scene had changed. And it was entirely about this little moment with Rhett Butler as the principal character in that scene, and the initiator of the scene, and Scarlett and Melanie. Clark Gable was an enormous star. Spencer Tracy, who was a big star himself, named Clark Gable the King. And both of them were on the Metro lot. Huge. He had everything to lose, Clark. And in those days, if you failed in 3 pictures in a row, you were out and you never got a job again. See, that's how tough that world was and how unforgiving. He was, I'm sure, very much concerned about playing Rhett Butler because the book had been such an enormous hit, huge, wide readership. Everyone had a concept of Rhett Butler, and his job was to somehow fulfill that concept. If he failed, that would be a blow almost irreparable to his career. So he felt his responsibility very, very deeply, very strongly. He had to protect himself. He had to do it. And in so doing, protect the film. Let's face it. So he had worked with Victor Fleming and made a film with him, and it had worked out extremely well. And Fleming was highly regarded. So it was Victor who was chosen to replace him. And I had an interesting experience. I had met Howard Hughes just before we started the filming, and you wouldn't think that a man who is so brilliant in another field did make films, but his specialty naturally was planes, flying them. And when I met him, he had not terribly long before made this great heroic flight to Moscow, beating all records. I don't think anyone had tried that. And he was a great hero, and that impressed me. He was a rather shy man, and he was 6'3", 3.5 thin. It was kind of a shy manner. And yet, in a whole community where the men every day played heroes on the screen and didn't do anything heroic in life, here was this man who was a real hero. And that impressed me very much in his rather shy manner. But you still wouldn't expect that he would have the insight that helped me in a moment of great distress. We had a dinner engagement the night after the night of the day when this decision was made to replace George Cukor. And we dined not far from the studio. I still had my makeup on. And I told him this terrible thing. I said, and Victor Fleming is going to replace George. And he said this, don't worry. With George and Victor, it is the same talent, only George's is strained through a finer sieve. And that was the most marvelous metaphor. It gave me confidence. And indeed, when my first scene took place with Fleming, he was a sensitive man. He called me to one side. It was a scene where Melanie greets Scarlett at the barbecue. And I saw their encounter as a kind of social encounter. And after the first rehearsal, he drew me aside. Look at the tact that he showed. And he said, remember, everything that Melanie says, she means. So I went back and thought of that and did the scene that way. Well, he got to the truth of the scene just as accurately as George. He was not as detailed as the director, but he had that wonderful sensitivity and sense of the core of the scene, the truth of the scene. We were in wonderful hands with him, and I trusted him from then on. The whole business of casting, putting it together, taking something like almost 3 years. The whole town was bored with the film. They were so bored with the film, they wished it bad luck. And they all thought it was going to be a big, big flop, a complete disaster, and they were rather pleased at the thought. Well, we just went ahead, quietly working ahead on the lot. 6 months, retakes after that, and just I knew we were making a film that was going to have quite a different history from any other film that had ever been made, and it would endure. And by heaven, it has it not? And the unifying factor was, of course, David Selznick. Change of direction. We all were directors. We also had Sam Wood, because Victor Fleming fell ill. He had a kind of nervous breakdown. After about 4 weeks of shooting, and Sam Wood came on the set to replace him. And eventually, when Victor was ready to come back, because we were by this time so far behind, David did something amazing. He kept both of them, so that you would start in the morning and you would film with Victor, change your costume, go to another stage, and continue in the afternoon, a different scene with Sam Wood. Now that is quite a strange practice. David just, we pulled through for him. We were able to do it because he believed we could. He was the unifying factor. Extraordinary. Extraordinary man, extraordinary. Extraordinary experience from every point of view, the making of that film. When we opened in Atlanta, there were only 3 stars in the program. It's there to see today, if you can get hold of one. And it's Clark Gable, Leslie Howard, and Olivia De Havilland in Gone with the Wind, introducing Miss Vivien Leigh. And then, of course, when she was this great, big, wonderful hit, perfectly accepted by the South, Atlanta, that was the question. Would the South, would Margaret Mitchell, would Atlantans, Georgians accept this English actress as Scarlett O'Hara? Well, they certainly did. And then she was starred. It was Gable, Vivien Leigh, Leslie Howard, and myself. Now, when it came to the question of being nominated for the Academy Award, David could not have Melanie and Scarlett competing for Best Actress. Neither one would win. The risk was very great that Mrs. Miniver, I think. No, wait, not Mrs. Miniver. That wonderful film with Robert Donat and Greer Garson. A marvelous, marvelous story. And other great performances that year by women. Really tremendous, tremendous performances in marvelous films. One of them would have got it, you see, because we would have competed against each other and drawn votes away from each other. Because a lot of people like Melanie, a lot of people preferred Melanie to Scarlett. So he had to find a means of protecting Scarlett. The success of that film depended on it. So he decided he must have got Jack Warner's permission to do this, to list me not as a star, which I was, but as a supporting actress. I never said a word when that happened, but of course it was a crushing blow. I never said a word. But now it was only competition to Hattie McDaniel, who was a supporting actress. But then, you know the most marvelous thing happened. people were very attached to Melanie, but they knew I wasn't a supporting actress. They knew that Hattie was, and they were not tricked, and they were not deceived, and they voted for Hattie. I thought that was smart. I didn't right away. The night of the awards, where it was, there was no God. No God. He didn't exist. I ceased to believe in him. And then 2 weeks later, I woke up one morning and I thought, what a wonderful world. I saw an entirely different perspective, a true perspective. And I thought, this is thrilling. That they were not deceived for a minute. And they voted for Hattie. And she got it. I finally began to do interesting work, like Melanie, but always on loan out to another studio. I was nominated for Melanie for Gone with the Wind, as you know, my work. And then 2 years later, I was loaned to Paramount for Hold Back the Dawn and was nominated again. So I realized that it was never at Warner's that I was going to have the work that I so much wanted to have. At the end of my contract, which was May of 1943, Warner's, it was a 7-year contract, yes. And so Warner's, because I had taken suspensions, I must explain that the parts didn't get interesting, and by this time I knew, after Melanie and Hold Back the Dawn, and Melanie to begin with, I believe, I knew that I had an audience. The people really were interested in my work, and they would go to see a film because I was in it, and I had a responsibility toward them, among other things. I couldn't bear to disappoint them by doing indifferent work in an indifferent film. And Jack would cast me in an indifferent film in an indifferent role. And I thought, I now have to refuse. I must do it. And I did. And of course, I was put on suspension. Now, the contracts allowed that in those days. If you said, no, I don't want to do this part, they would then suspend the contract for the length of time it took another actress to play the role. And they would take that period of time, tack it on to the end of the contract. So in May of 1943, I found myself with 6 months of suspension time. Warner loaned me immediately for a film I didn't want to do, but I went ahead and I did it. It was fortunately a big success. Not very good, but it was a big success. At least that was in its favor. Finished that, and then he loaned me to Columbia. The earlier film that I mentioned was RKO. This one was Columbia. And it was for a film that had 20 pages of script and a starting date the following Monday. Now, there was no hope for that film. None whatsoever. And no script. You didn't know how the character was going to develop. You didn't know how it should be costumed. You didn't know what kind of hairdresses she should have. Begin with, Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first women doctors, was the subject. So, as I recall it, I went to Harry Cohn, the head of the studio, and I said, Mr. Cohn, you've got 20 pages of script and a starting date next Monday. I haven't any idea about my character, and I cannot do this film. And you would just have to tell Jack Warner. he was really rather nice to me, Harry Cohn. Maybe he was rather relieved. I don't know. Quite nice, and he was supposed to be a real dragon. I kind of liked Harry Cohn, and because of that particular meeting, well, of course, I was put on a suspension. My agents, Phil Berg and Bert Allenberg, called me into their offices, South Beverly Drive, 121, I forgot the address. It could have been that, in August of 43. And with them was Martin Gang, a marvelous man and lawyer. And they said, we want you to talk to, well, Martin, to talk to you about your situation. He thinks there's a way out. So Martin explained that there was a California law which limited the right of an employer to enforce a contract against an employee for more than 7 years. And that no actor had dared to take advantage of the law by asking for declaratory relief, which is to say, an interpretation of the law as it applied to an actor's contract. I think a baseball player had done it, but no actor had ever dared to do it. So he said, this is what it entails. You go into the Superior Court, and there we will probably lose. It will be a single judge, and he will be influenced by Warner's lawyer, and he will see he was just a temperamental. He will see it in emotional terms, not in legal terms, just temperamental film actors. And then we will appeal, having lost the case in the Superior Court, to the Appellate Court, 3 judges. And they would judge the matters purely from the point of view of law. If we lose there is always the Supreme Court of the state of California, to which we can appeal. So I said, I'd like to read the law. And he provided it. And I read it. And it was quite brief, only about 3 paragraphs long. And I thought very clearly stated, and I thought its meaning quite obvious, that the 7 years meant calendar years, not 7 years of work. So I said, let's go ahead with it. And we're not going to get discouraged on the way. We will go straight to the Supreme Court. Well, we went into court first, the Superior Court, Judge Charles S. Burnell presiding, in November of that year, 1943. And it is true that Warner Brothers' lawyer did put me on the witness stand. And they said, be very careful, because he will try to make you angry and try and make you appear like a spoiled movie actress. And, oh, he was so wicked. Oh, gimlet-eyed. And he would say, accusingly in thunderous tones, is it not true, Mr. De Havilland, that on such and such a date you failed to report to the set to play such and such a role in such and such a film? And I, remembering Martin Gang's instructions, said, I didn't refuse. I declined. So all this time, the judge, I noticed that the judge, he had his hand in front of his face. And I couldn't figure out whether it was his spectacles that were twinkling or, in fact, his eyes. But we certainly had his attention, and I thought maybe I have a little hope here. I think maybe I have a chance, after all. And indeed, about 3 months later, or more than that, it was March of 1944, around the 15th of March, I was up on the island of Adak in the Aleutians visiting the patients in the military hospitals. Someone came to me, a soldier, and said, "We have a telegram for you." Well, this was really quite extraordinary up there in wartime. And it was from Martin Gang. And it said, "You've won in the Superior Court of, Superior Court of the State of California." Warner's naturally appealed immediately and enjoined every studio in town from employing me. Every studio in town, I think they sent out 125 injunctions, and half of the studios no longer existed. But they did a thorough job at that. Now, we went in to the appellate court with the 3 judges in September. I think it was September 10th, 1944. September. And Martin explained to me, "You will not be put on the witness stand, but it would be a very good idea for you to appear at the back of the courtroom as the 2 lawyers present their cases and their arguments, because that way the judges will know how much the outcome of the case means to you." So I appeared at the back of the court, and 2 of the judges understood Martin's arguments immediately they posed very few questions because they already understood the law and I suppose knew where they would stand. Now, the 3rd man was quite different, the 3rd judge. He questioned Martin very closely, and almost in an aggressive way, and almost in a agitated way, and questioned also the Warner's lawyer as well. And I was awfully worried about him, and so was Martin. He told me so afterwards. Well, I went off to the South Pacific to visit our soldiers there. Ended up in a barrack hospital with pneumonia as a patient myself. Finally got home to the States, and I think it was in early December of 44. And I think it was about the 16th of December, Martin phoned me. And he said, "You've won a unanimous decision in the appellate court of the state of California." Warner's appealed right away to the Supreme Court of the state of California. Now, the way it works, apparently, is that the Supreme Court takes a case for review, and if they feel there is no justification, no need to review it, because the previous decisions are sound, they will simply not accept it for review. But there is a certain period of time, and if you pass that period, I think it's 2.5 months, something like that, two months or whatever it is, maybe it's not quite that long. If that date is passed, and they have not taken it for review, then the previous decisions hold. And that is exactly what happened. And in early February, I knew that I was now free to do the work I wanted to do. There really wasn't any decision, any doubt about the right decision for me to take. And one of the nice things I thought was, if I do win, other actors feeling frustration such as I feel will not have to endure that. They'll take the suspension, going without pay, of course, but knowing they will not have to serve that time again. And indeed, I didn't realize that how much it could mean to other artists in the profession until actually about 2 or 3 years ago, I was at a luncheon in Hollywood and I sat next to a very charming and very able man, very highly regarded man, Roger Mayer, a lawyer. Now, he was not related to Louis B. Mayer, but he was apparently with Metro for a certain length of time. And he said what that meant to writers, you can't imagine. Writers like Scott Fitzgerald, and, well, Faulkner was one. He didn't mention those particular names, but indeed the names he meant were of equal stature. He said those men would be put under contract and then assigned some scene to write in a film for which they had no natural inclination and no knowledge. I mean, say a Western with a writer whose great specialty was the Deep South. He said those men couldn't bear to do a poor piece of work, and they knew that they would, and that they would risk their great international reputations in going ahead and trying to meet the requirement of the studio. Now, when you won your case, they were thrilled because, of course, they were perfectly willing to go without pay until they were assigned some kind of work for which they had a feel and knew that they could do a distinguished piece of work by. You know, our fellows, our actors, they were extraordinary in World War II. They all went. They all went. Jimmy Stewart, he was a bomber pilot, 21 raids over Germany. Clark Gable, tail gunner. The others in the Navy, Marine Corps, they were extraordinary. Now, when they came back, you see, all the time they were at war, they were on suspension. When they came back, they would have to serve that time all over again. And at the salary, which was by this time outmoded, because when they were lending people right and left, the producers were paying the actor the normal salary, which was the contracted salary, but they would collect from the producer they were lending the services of the actor to, they would collect a lot of money and keep it, go to the actor. So certain actors really had quite high prices. They didn't get the money, but the price for their services had risen during the war through this system. Now, that meant that these actors would come back and have to serve. Their services would be infinitely more valuable, but they would still get the same salary that they had been receiving 5 years before. And Jimmy Stewart came back, and all those others, Tyrone Power, the lot. And he wanted, of course, to take advantage of my case. And it was suggested that he better not risk anything. He'd better ask for declaratory relief. Did it apply to an actor who'd gone off to war? And of course it did. And that was settled straight away because it was a question not of work, but of calendar years. And therefore all those chaps, those brave, splendid young men, were able to negotiate new contracts. every cloud does have a silver lining. Because when I was put on suspension by Jack Warner in 43, August, or rather when I went to court and therefore was enjoined from working, I wanted to do something, contribute to the war effort. I wanted to find something, and under contract I couldn't. But now that I was enjoined from working, I was free. And the USO, I'd done bond caravans, that sort of thing. But the USO asked me, they said, you can't sing and you can't dance. Would you consider visiting our military patients in military hospitals in the Christmas season of 1943? And I said, oh, yes, I certainly would. And I had a beau. He was in Italy and risking his life, really, making documentary films for the Signal Corps. And I thought, well, I want my December to be constructive in some way. And so I said, certainly yes. And they started me off at a very large military hospital in Chicago with a program that would take me through the Christmas season, mainly in Oklahoma, with a couple of stops in Texas afterwards. I started in Chicago. And in between wards, a man presented himself in uniform, a major, and he introduced himself. He said, I'm Major Richardson, and I'm in charge of the psychiatric ward here. I was in charge at Bellevue, previous to my Army service in New York City. I have a theory. It's an experiment I would like you to agree to, that if you visited my patients, your visit would do some good. Would you agree? And I said, well, of course I would. He said, I have to have the post-surgeon, the head of the hospital's approval first. And I'll come back and meet you between wards to let you know if I've received it. Well, he met me between wards, and he said, I've got the permission. So at the end of your day, I've read your orders, I know exactly what time and at what ward you will finish. I'll come and get you. And he said, or I'll send for you. You have nothing to worry about. I will have 2 very sturdy orderlies to protect you. Well, I hadn't worried before then, but I certainly began at that moment to protect. Well, anyway, he met me and the 2 sturdy orderlies. We got into a lift and we rose to his floor, and there was a padlock on the door, and one of the orderlies unlocked it, and we entered his ward. Now, I was very, very anxious to be a success for Major Richardson. And there was a boy right there, sitting right there, big, kind of husky boy, not tall, but muscular and blue eyes and brown hair, and his maroon corduroy dressing gown and his gray pajamas. And so I went up to him and I said, well, hello there. No reaction. He didn't even look at me. I said, well, it's nice to see you today. No reaction. What's your name? No reaction. Oh, well, what state do you come from? No reaction. Well, I asked 5 questions, failed miserably with each question. And I thought, I am a total catastrophe. I have failed Major Richardson and this experiment. Well, they were all watching me, these doctors. So I passed to the next patient. And I had much better luck with him. And things began to look brighter. And from then on, they were really very bright. And Major Richardson explained to me, he said, you know, that first boy that you encountered was in a catatonic state. And of course he wouldn't respond. It was a totally unresponsive state. But when he comes out of it, he will remember every single detail of what happened in much greater precision and detail than any of us. So when we finished, he said, I think it's been a success. Now, I want you to do something for me. You have many hospitals on your schedule. At each hospital, I ask you to go first to the post surgeon and tell him that you would like to visit a psychiatric ward, and there will be one in every hospital you visit. And then ask him to ask the doctor, the psychiatrist in charge of the psychiatric ward, if he would like me to make that visit. I beg you to do that. So I said I would do it, and I kept my promise. Now, I asked him about that boy who was in the catatonic state. I said, is he a battle case? And he said, oh, no. He said, he's a farm boy, healthy farm boy. And just being ripped out of his lovely life and thrust into the rigorous impersonality of camp discipline and training was simply too much for him. And he said, none of our cases here are battle cases. None of them. There's environmental shock these boys are going through. I thought that very extraordinary. Up in the Aleutians, it was the same thing, and Alaska. In the Aleutians, however, I think it was Attu. I did meet some soldiers who had been in the invasion of Attu, and they were battle cases, but all over. And when I got to Fiji, I was grounded at Nandi, and I visited, of course, their hospital on Nandi's side of Fiji. And it was a barrack hospital with two wings, just one story, two wings, and in the middle there were three little cubicles with one window, and the fourth wall was just a sheet, and they were for officers. And luckily one of them, when I got pneumonia, which I did almost immediately, I was put into one of those little cubicles. But before before that happened to me, I had visited the hospital. There was one patient in the physical ward, and I think there were 25 in the psychiatric ward. I came back from this experience, and I thought, because there was a great stigma to mental illness at that time, it was not understood. And families that had a case would never speak of it to anybody else. It was a true skeleton in the closet. I thought, these boys, their families, how are they going to react? They need education. They need hope. And the boys must be treated with some kind of understanding. And then, of course, the snake pit came along. That was wonderful. That was just after the end of the war. And here was my opportunity to do something about that. And it was a marvelous story. It was an autobiography written by this young woman who had become really seriously mentally ill, was institutionalized and remarkably was cured in a day when they had no drugs at all for treatment. But the therapy that they used then actually worked in her case. And so I thought this will educate families, it will be, people will understand, patients will understand, and it's a hopeful story because it ends in a cure. And that film in New York, when it was released, ran 1 year in one theater. People flooded to it. Well, I think it was the first serious study of mental illness, of a character's serious study. And of course, I saw all the experiences that Virginia Cunningham endured. I saw shock. That was very moving because, well, but the body, under shock rises like this, and there is terrible danger that it will slide off the table when it comes back, and bones can be broken. And what in particular hospital it was a California hospital that I visited, something so touching happened. They had a team of patients who were undergoing shock treatment help the patient who had been assigned that therapy for a certain day, and they would one would hold this shoulder, another would hold the other. All of them having been through shock and still programmed for that, the hips or the knees or the ankles. And I saw the body rise, they held on, and of course nothing happened. No injury ensued to the patient. I saw her afterwards, and then several days later, and the whole experience was altogether extraordinary. To each his own, right away, Universal with The Dark Mirror, which is such a fascinating, to each his own, just what I wanted to do, following the life and interpreting the life of a girl of 16 straight through to the age 45, when she is in London and a successful businesswoman during the war. A marvelous story, very well told, beautifully done. Then The Dark Mirror was extraordinary as an assignment. Twins, one psychotic, the other normal. Did a lot of research for that too, of course. We tried to shoot in sequence, and I was quite thin then. I'd gone on a diet and lost a lot of weight, and that was quite suitable for the 16-year-old Jody Norris. And the costumes helped. I loved studying the hairdress, working out the hairdresses according to period with the hairdresser. I had a very good hairdresser, good makeup man too, at Paramount. And of course, Edith Head did a superb job. And all of that, I thought of what could help me. I thought, well, cologne also, the scent. Scents will be helpful in building a character. I thought, well, I looked to see what was available, and there was one called Apple Blossom, and I thought, for the very first scenes of Judy, Apple Blossom, that'd just be perfect. So I bought Apple Blossom cologne. Then I thought, well, now when she's slightly older, but still, in the village, lilac. Lilac will do it. And so I found colognes to express the character and the character's age and environment experience. Now, I then wanted to know what I should use for Jody as she becomes, rather successful, she's wearing a tea gown and smoking cigarettes. And I asked Mother in that particular year, what was the fashion? And she said, oh, chypre. I don't know what that means in French, but anyhow, I then asked for chypre, and I got an approximation to it. For Miss Norris, I chose Chanel No. 5. I thought that was appropriate for Miss Norris, and that's what I chose for her. I think you have to have a very kind of responsive nature, but think about you. Think about anyone who reads a book. You visualize the characters. You become one with each of the characters. You do. And I fancy that reading gives you all these extraordinary experiences that are helpful in understanding people for just a person without an acting talent. But for an acting talent, you see it's a very developing thing. And I think with a character, you have to, if you're going to do a good job, you have to empathize either instinctively and through feeling or intellectually, and preferably in both ways. But empathy is very much involved, of course. I saw her in the play, wonderfully played by Wendy Hiller, a brilliant performance, but very stylized. It was an adaptation of Henry James Washington's Square, as you know. And I thought, well, I see another way to play Catherine, because stylization will not work on film and be artificial. I just knew at the end of the second act, I had to play Catherine. I had to do it. And I thought of that. I was, of course, by now completely independent and could make my own decisions and take my own initiatives. So I thought of the directors who would have a particular feel for this material, and whom I admired. Two of them I had worked with, and the third I had not worked with. The first two were caught up in other commitments and were not free. The third one had just founded, together with two other directors, Capra and George Stevens, his own independent film company, Liberty Films at Paramount, and that man was Willy Wyler. So my agent persuaded him to say nothing to anyone but get on the train, go to New York, see the heiress. And he, of course, was looking for material. It was quite wonderful. Never will forget the night I knew he had arrived, the day he arrived in New York, and I knew he would go straight to the theater to see the play. And he had promised to call me afterwards. And I waited for that phone call. And I waited. And it came. And he said, I've seen it. I like it. Let's do it. And we did. Ralph, of course, Ralph Richardson, shouldn't call him by his first name like that without tacking on the last one, was an extremely distinguished and gifted British artist, really, really wonderful artist, revered to this day in the profession. But he would do rather naughty things. I mean, he was a glove flapper. that is a British theatre trick. And I remember one scene, and it was quite cool to me, and frightfully English, really, rather. And the two of us, it was an intimate scene, and very important that Catherine, all her feelings, everything, captured the audience's attention fully. Ralph Richards, the father, glove flapping. This distracted me, of course, in the rehearsals, terribly, just as an actress. But what I was worried about was Catherine. The attention of the audience had to be on her without a distraction like that. And Willie, who was very impressed by Ralph, I went to him and I said, "What about that glove flapping?" He said, "Don't worry." He said, "I framed it so the gloves are out." I still had to put up with the terrible distraction, but it didn't matter. I knew that Catherine was protected. I often wonder, because Willie was really quite rude to me on the set, in that he would sit with Ralph, sit together, engagement, conversation, ignore me completely as we were waiting for a scene to be lit. And I would be sitting there like Cinderella in my little chair, nobody speaking to me, the two gentlemen speaking, no one paying any attention to me at all. And it is entirely possible that Willie did that deliberately to make me feel sort of inadequate and, sort of uninteresting and, certainly not the focus of attention, I'll tell you that. Monty was his second picture. His first, Red River, I believe it was, had not yet been released, but people had seen it and knew he was marvelous in it. So he came to play Morris Townsend in the Earth. Now, he had a Polish lady friend, and who was apparently a highly respected coach, theater coach, very talented woman, and she would be at the back of the stage, and he would work out, to begin with, he would work out at night every one of his scenes with the Polish lady. And I knew that when he was working with me, he wasn't working with me at all. He was working with the Polish woman in our scenes together. It was most peculiar. But I just decided I've got to make use of this in some fashion. And I managed psychologically to do that because, in fact, he was performing, giving a performance, Morris Townsend. He was really thinking of my house. So I was able to get around that psychologically. But he would then, when we would finish the scene, he would look up to see, he knew exactly where she would be stationed, to see whether she nodded or she said, if she went this way, he would say, "Can we do the scene again?" Now, this wasn't fun for me. It wasn't fun for anyone, and it certainly wasn't for William Wyler, a very distinguished man, as the director of the film. And one day we came on the set, and it was a long and difficult scene, and he said, "I don't know what this scene is all about. I want you to show me. Just get up there, start there with your scripts, and just show me what this scene is all about." Well, it was frightful. There we were stumbling along, and we'd do, exchange, 10 lines, and he would say, "Stop. I want you to go back to the beginning. Keep this little exchange that you made with the third lines, exchange of lines. Leave everything else out. Do something different. I don't care what you do, as long as it's different. But keep just that. So we would do that, and then he would say, stop. He would say, keep the first exchange, then I want you to keep the sixth exchange, drop everything else, start again. We did that for 4 hours. And I think Monty Cliff realized that perhaps he should kind of work things out with William Wyler and Mr. De Havilland. Well, my parents were there at the time. But of course there's more to the story than that. My father went out to Japan very young, Cambridge graduate, in 1893 to teach in the Anglican communities, missionary communities, and schools in Japan. And my mother went out much later. In 1907, she was 21. My father was 21 when he went out in 93. My mother, in 1907, was 21. She went out to teach choral singing to an Anglican community. And I said to her in the last days of her life, I said, Mother, do you mean to tell me that you went out to Japan in 1907 at the age of 21 without a chaperone? And she said, I was in charge of the captain. I said, Mother, you were in charge of the captain? And she said, I was in the captain's charge. He went mad in the Malay Straits. I said, Mother, were you the cause? And she replied, there were some who said so. That was my mother. But my mother was quite a remarkable person, and she had great charm. She soloed, I gather, at St. Andrew's Church in the Anglican Church in Tokyo. And this story she told me herself, that one day a woman came up to her and said, you have a very beautiful voice. It was a warm soprano. And I would like to write a musical play for you. And this alarmed my mother because she knew all about singing and music, but she knew nothing about acting. So she thought, well, maybe I should learn about acting. And she went back to England. I think it must have been 1911, and I know for a fact, because I've done a lot of research, having a passion for accuracy. She enrolled in January of 1912 at Sir Beerbohm Tree's Academy, which then, in a few years, was licensed as the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, known familiarly today as RADA. When she finished her course is there, the representatives, agents would come and audition the students, RADA students, or the Beerbohm Tree students right there. And they were interested in her largely because of her beautiful singing voice. And so she did get some concert engagements after that, between summer of 1912 and the summer of 1914, when my father, who had courted her for had been interested in her for 7 years and courted her unsuccessfully in Japan. He told me this story himself. When August of 1914 came along, of course, as an Englishman, he sailed all the way back to England to offer his service. It was a very good shot, apparently. And they said, well, he was over 40 by then. He said, well, we're not really looking for chaps like you. Must have been 40, 42, I think. Not at your age. Go back to Japan. and proceed as you are in your business. He had bought a firm of international patent attorneys, quite different from the way he started out as a teacher. But anyway, it was a very successful international firm, a very important firm of patent attorneys. So he decided to look up my mother, to track her down, and he did. And again, he proposed to her. And again, she was not at all in favor. But he persuaded her to flip a coin, or the two of them decided to flip a coin. And she lost, which meant she had to marry him. And off they went. I was born July the 1st, 1916. And later on, my sister was born October 22nd of 1917. And so and I learned Japanese first, and people ask me, can you still speak Japanese? And I say, ichi, ni, san, chi, go, roku, shichi, hachi, etc. That's counting up to 10 in Japanese. This is really quite astounding. Soon after they arrived as a married couple in Tokyo, or both of them returning, of course, to their former home, their separate homes in Tokyo. This time they returned as a married couple. And my mother was, having gone to Suburban Trees Academy, then became interested in amateur theatricals in Tokyo. And the British apparently had a renowned amateur theatrical company in Tokyo. So sure enough, what do you think happened? She gave a performance. It performed of all things, it was a musical play, perhaps written by the very lady who came up to her that day several years before and admired her voice and said she wanted to write a musical play. Well, it was Kismet. Kismet. Everybody thinks that the first musical version of Kismet was the one that had such a great success in New York City. Well, it wasn't. It was this performance, a musical play of Kismet, presented in 1918, I think it was. Yes, the summer of 1918 in Tokyo, Japan. And it was presented for a very special reason. The king's brother, the Duke of Connaught, Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, was making a state visit representing the British government, the Crown, in Japan. And between the Japanese and the British, a program for his visit had been laid out. And one of the chief events in this program was for His Royal Highness to witness the musical play Kismet, starring my mother, and whoever it was who played the part, the male part, opposite her. And I have a letter written by an officer at the British Embassy the following morning to my mother, telling her of the Duke of Connaught's great pleasure in the performance, and he particularly admired her work and that of whoever it was who played opposite her. Well, that was a tremendous event in my mother's life, as you could well imagine. I think my father was quite pleased about that sort of thing, too. He was quite proud of her. And off she went. We had 2 properties up in Karizawa in the mountains for the summer. People fled Tokyo in the summer because the heat is quite extreme. You would either go to the sea or the mountains, preferably the mountains. Karizawa was not too far from Tokyo, so that's where we went. And then, unfortunately, in this great triumphant moment in my mother's life. A missionary's wife came to call on her one day at Korizawa and said, "Do you know that your husband, it is the talk of Tokyo, is having an affair with one of the maids in the household?" You cannot imagine the humiliation that would be for a woman in this small foreign community of diplomats and businessmen of high repute, engineers and others that the Japanese had in fact invited. Some had invited to teach Western skills to Japanese. Well, the story that I heard from my mother was that she went down to Tokyo and went into the house, and sure enough, in one of the maid's rooms, she found my father's gold watch. And from then on, of course, the marriage was doomed. She would not go back to that house again, and I don't think she wanted ever to go back to Tokyo again. That was the degree of her humiliation. They then decided, of course, that my mother had to find some place to live, preferably outside of Japan. And there were several possibilities, and the decision was, the final decision was that my father would buy some land near Victoria on Vancouver Island, 14 acres, that was his ideal, what he would be looking for, with a very pleasant house. And then he would make regular visits to us from Tokyo by the northern route, which was only a week, you see, at sea. Whereas if you cross from Tokyo to San Francisco, it's 2 weeks, but not the northern route to Canada, 1 week only. And that seemed a very reasonable plan. They intended to go first to San Francisco so that we could consult Dr. Langley Porter, who was one of the first pediatricians and a renowned one. His fame had reached Tokyo, Japan. We never got to Vancouver Island. We never proceeded up the coast to Canada because Langley Porter took one look at my tonsils. He said, "These have got to come out immediately." So my father, and I remember his leaving us, out came my tonsils. And I can remember that very well. She then leased in a small flat, two floors, in a small house that belonged to a San Francisco family, whom I think my father must have known in business. And we stayed there for 6 months. I know that because of a researcher doing some work for me. And then we went down to the Vendôme Hotel for a week or two in San Jose. It was a beautiful Victorian hotel. And people from the East Coast used to come out and spend the winters there. Beautiful grounds. And she liked it very much. The San Francisco fog followed my mother down to San Jose. Now, it is true that it burned off at 11 o'clock in the morning, but nonetheless, she rather liked the idea of escaping it entirely. She heard of a village across the valley, in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains, on the other side of which, of course, is the Pacific Ocean. So she crossed the valley, 12 miles, to the foothills one day, and took us to lunch at this chalet. on Oak Street, and it was called Lundblad's Lodge. The proprietors were Swedish, and Mrs. Lundblad was the most wonderful cook in the entire world. My mother decided, of course, that that she would like to settle in this lovely little village surrounded by prune orchards and apricot orchards and pear orchards, and with hills all about, covered in the springtime with all sorts of beautiful wildflowers of every color, and of course in the season California poppies, which I think, Mariposa I think they were called, almost entirely disappeared. In the grounds, in the little garden, front garden of Lundblad's Lodge, there were hummingbirds and bluebirds and woodpeckers and all kinds of birds and beautiful butterflies, swallowtail butterflies, yellow and black, and little blue butterflies and monarch butterflies. We lived this marvelous life in nature, surrounded by nature. Many, many, many years later, in the early 50s, my father, I asked my father to come down to Los Angeles and visit me in Beverly Hills. And I was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel at that time with my little son, Benjamin Briggs Goodrich, descended from one of the founders of the Republic of Texas, his namesake too. And so I asked my father to come down, and he said to me one day, "You know, I never could understand your mother. What caused the breach?" And I said, "Well, Father, it's because a missionary's wife told her in Karizawa that summer, that fatal summer, 1918, after her great triumph, that you were having an affair with one of the maids in the household." And he said, "Oh," he said. And I said that my mother found your gold watch in one of the maid's rooms. He said, "My gold watch?" He was really quite puzzled by that. And he said, "You know, I had a great friend who was in British intelligence, and he was the protector, as it were, of a young Japanese. And the situation became dangerous for her. And my friend asked me if I would shelter her in the house. And I said, of course. And so I let her stay in the house. Isn't that extraordinary? That whole terrible break occurred through a total misunderstanding. Somebody said to me when I told them this story, "Which story do you believe? Your mother's or your father's?" And I thought, well, my mother's story, was it for her a true story? My father's story, I think, was the true story. I really do think that. Yes, because he was a rather prudish man, and he was 36 years old, he confided to me. He was the son of a vicar before he had any sort of, experience, as it were. And I think that was arranged by the Japanese, probably with one of those lovely ladies who are trained in conversation, in music, and in other arts as well. The first book that made an impression on me when I was very young was sent by my Aunt Ethel, my mother's sister from England. It was published in 1919 for the benefit of the Red Cross in the First World War, and it was called Edmund Dulac's Picture Book. It was a wonder, full of the most beautiful illustrations by Edmund Dulac and also Arthur Rackham, who was one of the other celebrated illustrators of the day. It was a book of fairy stories. The Princess and the Pea was in it. I can remember that, and the Arabian Nights, that was in it. Oh, exquisite book, and I have it to this day. Then, of course, with nature all around us, I was very much interested in Thornton Burgess's books. I loved those books, Child's Garden of Verses. And then later on, the Captain Marryat's Children of the New Forest, that made an impression on me, and The Three Musketeers. I loved The Three Musketeers, and Peggy Baker, my friend from Lundblad's Lodge, her mother had decided to buy a house in Saratoga, right near ours, right near. And so she and I became continued to be great friends, and we would act out plays and that kind of thing, we would act out as plays, books we had read. And she said, well, all right, let's play Three Musketeers. And I said, yes, let's play Three Musketeers. And we decided who we were going to be. I think I was Athos, and she was, as she said, she said, I'll be D'Artagnan. And I went home to my mother. I said, well, we're going to play Three Musketeers, and I'm Athos, and Peggy is D'Artagnan. And my mother said, you don't pronounce it that way. It's D'Artagnan. So I said to Peggy, well, you don't pronounce it D'Artagnan. She said, you don't pronounce it D'Artagnan? No, you pronounce it D'Artagnan. And so she went home to her mother, and her mother was very offended with my mother. They were great friends, played bridge together all the time, but there was rather a cold moment there for a week or so over the pronunciation of D'Artagnan. Of course, we settled for D'Artagnan. While we were staying at Lundblad's Lodge, she learned that the neighbor, that big shingled house, Mrs. Hanchett was her name, very talented woman, had decided to run a kind of preschool, nursery school, where she would teach how to spell, how to count to children. And, of course, my mother was enthralled by this, and off my sister and I went, and we learned with an abacus how to count. I can remember that very well. And though I did learn how to count in Japanese, as you know. Then, when I went to school, and it was very heroic by going to school that first day of school, my mother had always spoken of the children. They did make a great deal of noise. The schoolyard was right next to Lundblad's. And she said, oh, those wild Indians. And I thought, oh, this first morning when I had to go across the street to school with the wild Indians. And my mother took my photograph. I've got it, as I heroically crossed the street to mingle with the wild Indians. I came home for lunch triumphantly. I'd survived the wild Indians. But in any case, with all this training that I'd got at Mrs. Hanchett's nursery school, I did very well in my studies, and it was kind of boring. I took a book and read. Now, this broke all the rules. There were two classes. Miss Richards was her name, very nice woman. Two classes in one schoolroom, first and second grades. And of course, while she was teaching the second grade, I had nothing to do. It was awfully hard, and the talk was that I should maybe skip a grade and go into the second grade. But I can remember seeing, I think it was Walton Wickett from Lumlat's Lodge. He ended up by being a professor, engineer, and I think the story is he designed the door, the Bombay door, for the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb. Well, anyway, Walton was a crackerjack at math, and he would get up with a chalk and the blackboard and figure things out. And I thought, oh, I will never be able to do that. And that's why I never skipped into the second grade. I just stayed there in first grade, comfortably, but bored. And from then on, I loved all my studies. We had wonderful teachers. All the classrooms, as I recall it, had two classes. The third and fourth, I know, were together. I'm not sure about fifth and sixth, but I think it's possible. The seventh, no, that was a single class, Miss Ashworth. And Bertha Seeley, the principal, taught the eighth grade. I remember that very well indeed. But the most marvelous experience, I think, they were all wonderful teachers, loved every one of them, was Mrs. Reed, fifth grade and sixth. And Mrs. Reed emphasized the arts in her teaching of these youngsters. And she encouraged us to write poetry and to draw. And so we, in our time off, 2 or 3 of us would go together and go off and to some pretty place and draw. And we would write poems and recite them read them to each other. She was really remarkable. And I love spelling. I got very, very good in spelling, and I was so proud to have been chosen by the school to represent it at the county spelling bee, where I was competing with all of these crackerjack students from schools all over the valley, including Bellarmine, I believe, the Roman Catholic private school in San Jose. And, well, that boy, that wicked boy, he beat me out. So I came in second and went back to Saratoga, and they had a special assembly so that I could tell the entire student body about my thrilling experience at the county spelling bee, where I represented Saratoga Grammar School and came in second. I wish I had come in first. Oh. One of the great features of Saratoga, when we moved there were only 800 people. Our telephone number was number 7. Nonetheless, it attracted interesting people from all over the world. There was Nunky McGlue, who was Standard Oil, he was British, out in Hong Kong, who decided to settle there in Saratoga. The Goodrich family was a very old olive-growing family, and they had a beautiful estate called Hayfield House, 14 acres, oddly enough, right near where my mother built her house. They were a fascinating family, and Mr. Goodrich, Chauncey Goodrich, was a lawyer in San Francisco. So this was to quite a few families. The father would commute to San Francisco for stockbrokers and other professions, as well as people who had come from other parts of the country. and settle there in retirement. So you had a rather sophisticated, experienced, traveled, cultivated community interested naturally in the arts. And one of the town people who was quite renowned was Dorothea Johnston, not Vivian Abbott, and she was remarkable. That I won't deal with her at the moment, but Dorothea Johnston. She had studied drama in England and had done a remarkable thing there. She had studied at one of the great British libraries and museums, American Indians. And Dorothea learned some Indian songs and how to beat a tom-tom. And she acquired an Indian drum. She had a costume made, an Indian costume, and a headdress, feathers. And she gave concerts. And she looked, you could say, yes, she has Indian blood. Yes, she does. She looks like an Indian chief, rather, like the one that's on the nickel. Somewhat. Well, yes, there is perhaps, yeah. Well, she was the rage of London. All the hostesses wanted her to come and entertain after dinner. And there's, the fingers of the sun around the mountain. Woo, woo, woo. It was a grand performance. We loved it. We children adored it, having Dorothea give a concert in the village. And then, of course, we would sneak around and say, the fingers of, well, not very nice of us, but we did. Now, Dorothea was even presented to the Queen in London. That's how celebrated she was. When she came back from her English adventures in London, in England, she made friends with the drama department, the professors of the drama department at Stanford University. One of them, Frederick Stover, had graduated from Yale Drama School, and the two of them decided that they would like to put on some amateur performances in the village of Saratoga. Of course, the village of Saratoga was very excited about that. And all these charming people were eager to come and see Dorothea and Freddie Stover's first play. The play they chose was Alice in Wonderland. Freddie designed the sets, and he played the Griffin. He called on some of his students at Stanford to play some of the parts. And we were a mélange of Stanford students and local children. I was cast as Alice, and Willis Peck, very tiny. He was the son of the owner of the Saratoga News. Llewellyn B. Peck was his name. Well, Willis played the duck, and Willis is my friend to this day, the duck. Anyway, we presented it at the Saratoga Foothill Club. That's right. Designed by Julia Morgan. That's the way Saratoga did things. Julia Morgan, the great woman architect of the day. She designed Hearst Castle. But Saratoga, only the best for Saratoga. Well, it was a local success, and its renown spread so that we were invited to give the same performance at the Palo Alto Community Theater, which was very celebrated. We did. And to that performance came George C. Warren, the critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, and the best review I have ever received, at the age of 16, was from George C. Warren of the San Francisco Chronicle, reviewing Alice in Wonderland. And we went on and performed at the Women's City Club in San Francisco, San Jose State University. I had to be called out of the classroom. By now, of course, I was in high school at Los Gatos Union High School. Saratoga was too small to have a high school. And so the Saratoga students would take the Red Peninsula car over to Los Gatos, to another beautiful, beautiful school with wonderful teachers. And that's the story of Alice in Wonderland. The second production that Freddie Stover and Dorothy decided to present in the village of Saratoga was to be an outdoor production. Dorothy's mother, Mrs. Johnston, owned the Saratoga Inn. And the Saratoga Inn had lovely gardens in front and something magical behind. You took a pathway down to the village creek, and there was this wonderful grove of sycamore trees surrounding the village creek, the perfect site for an outdoor production of Midsummer Night's Dream. So this was scheduled for June, after I graduated June 17th? I don't know. In any case, graduated from high school. We were going to present, and I was to play Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Helped to make my own costume. Mrs. Johnson made the costumes. And Freddie again designed the sets, and this time he played Bottom. Well, it was the Depression. I knew I had to go to college. There was no question about it. In Saratoga, the girls all went to college. It was unthinkable if you didn't. Whereas in England, of course, it was unthinkable that a girl would go to university. And so I tried out for a scholarship and took an exam at Stanford, sat at Stanford for males, passed in Group 1, and won the scholarship. And this I knew as early as, I think, April of 1934, before I graduated. And Mills was known for its drama and speech arts course. And I thought, well, I'll major in that, I think, because, well, I don't know what else to major in. So I'll major in that. And the main thing is, I hope that I don't know what I really want to do in life. I should have a career. I would like to have a profession. We were all encouraged, girls were, more or less, to think about that in those days because of the Depression. And so I thought, well, at least I'll have these 4 years sort of sequestered from life and studying, and I'll take this major and in drama and speech arts and hope to win a scholarship for the following year, because the only way I can get through college is by doing that. But I hope I'll find what I really should do in life. And all of us, I think, were brought up with a sense that we had a place in life, that there was a right course for all of us to take, each of us to take, which would be the right course, a special pathway or individual to ourselves. Well, I read in the newspapers that Max Reinhardt, who was the greatest living theatrical personage of the day, would be presenting Midsummer Night's Dream in the Hollywood Bowl, the San Francisco Opera House, and the Faculty Glade and Greek Theater in Berkeley, at the University of California in Berkeley. Well, I thought, golly, if I could watch his rehearsals, I'll be so good at everything I try to do. I will have learned so much, and I'll have such prestige. My drama and speech arts course at Mills, that I'm sure to win my sophomore scholarship. So it turned out that Dorothea Johnson knew Professor Sibley of the University of California, and his daughter, Catherine Sibley. Catherine Sibley had studied with Reinhardt in a time, or gone off to Europe, at a time when there were no arts theater festivals in the United States, but Europe was alive with them, and it was very fashionable to go, this season and go do all the festivals. And it was she who said to her father, I believe, well, why can't California have a festival? Well, it was obviously a very, very good idea. And so the California Festival Association had been formed. Well, Dorothea, knowing Catherine Sibley, asked her if I might watch the rehearsals. Catherine Sibley came down and saw one of the performances, and I must tell you about those performances. We had 3 performances. She came down to see our Saratoga performance in the theater of the Glade. The audience sat over on a platform constructed over the village stream. Rather festival in its feeling, right then and there. And we had a full moon for all 3 performances. It was pretty magical. Catherine Sibley came to one of the performances, and she said, well, yes, I will try and arrange. I'll try to arrange this for you. And when Felix Weisberger came ahead to the University of California to examine the faculty Glade and the Greek Theater, he was Reinhardt's casting director, sort of general manager of the production. She made an appointment for me to meet him up there for dinner at a little restaurant near the campus. And he said, well, I'd like to hear you reading a Puck. And it just so happened that I had brought with me my gym bloomers and my tennis shoes. So we retired to the faculty room, and I put on my gym bloomers, and I put on my tennis shoes, and I leapt all over the tables and chairs of the faculty room, giving my exuberant performance of Puck in Midsummer Night's Street. To my astonishment, Felix Weisberger, watching this extraordinary performance, said, I would like you to meet me tomorrow morning in San Francisco, which is where I'm staying, at my hotel at 9:30, and I want you to study the part of Hermia. Well, this was quite a request, but I was keen for it. Dorothea drove me all the way down to Saratoga that night, 35 miles an hour. Took us almost 2 hours to get there, 35 miles up the coast to meet up the valley to San Francisco to meet on time, and we were on time, Felix Weisberger at his hotel. And there I read The Lions of Hermia. And at the end of this reading, I was 17, he said, if you come down to Hollywood in 4 weeks' time, you may understudy the role of Hermia. Well, can you imagine what that meant incredible news. I was now going to be an official member of the Reinhardt Company. Well, I was going to get scholarships straight through my senior year, no question about that, with this kind of prestige and learning experience. Well, in 4 weeks' time, of course, I was down there. 2 artists drove me down. They saw to it that I was established in a very nice, very respectable little hotel run by Ruth B. Kinney. She was a lady lawyer, and I shared her bathroom with her, and so she could keep a full eye on me at all times and protect me from whatever dangers lurked in this strange city of which I had no knowledge. Well, I found Felix Weisberger, disappointed to learn I was not the first second understudy. First understudy, a darling girl from Palo Alto, homegrown. Jean Rouverol, under contract to Paramount, loaned for this particular function as first understudy for the role of Hermia. Now, the role of Hermia had to have an understudy because you'll never guess who was cast as Hermia. None other than a graduate of UC, under contract to Paramount, named Gloria Stewart, who years later won an Academy Award for her performance in Titanic. I owe a lot to her. I owe my whole career to that lady. And she therefore could not come to the rehearsals because on loan out from Paramount to Warner Brothers, she was making a film. Now they thought the film would finish in good time so that she would be able to actually perform in the play. But she was able to come to only 3 rehearsals. Jean Rouverol dropped out, had to make a film with W.C. Fields at Paramount. I was the first understudy. I took all the rehearsals, all but 3, and I started receiving Max Reinhardt's direction. Well, and it turned out that as the days went by and weeks passed, and as the opening night drew closer, it was evident that the company could not get along with this, by this time I was 18-year-old schoolgirl who was understudying Hermia. They couldn't have the rehearsals without her. They had to have her. I understood this, that I had this huge responsibility toward this company, and here Professor Dr. Reinhardt and the California Festival Association and the Hollywood Bowl, the San Francisco Opera House even, but certainly the Hollywood Bowl. And I thought, the day for enrollment at Mills was getting closer, and I wasn't going to be able to report. I had to stick with the company. So I wrote to the Dean of Women and explained why I couldn't report. And she wrote back. I think her name was Miss Dakin. She wrote back and said, "That's quite all right. Don't worry about it. Your scholarship will be perfectly good in February for the spring term." Now, the day approached opening night, and 5 days before that fatal night, September 17th, 1934, Jesse Wadsworth, Gloria Stewart's agent, came to a morning rehearsal, it was, and said to Reinhardt, "We're very sorry, but Miss Stewart will not be able to go on opening night." So Reinhardt turned to me, Herr Professor Doctor, and he said, "You will play the part." And I did. But I must tell you, that opening night is a night I hope never to live through again, at least the first part of it. No, just the first part. I had a terrible attack of stage fright. I never did with Alice in Wonderland. And I had, for my supper, I had drunk tomato juice. And there we were in the wings. Oh, and I must describe to you this set. Oh, how wonderful it was. I was in the wings. And I had to go behind the bushes, and I lost my tomato juice. And the first assistant had to take me by the shoulder and say, he said to me, "You're on." And he pushed me on stage. Now, terrified, I went with the 3 other lovers round the stage, which in a minute I will describe, to our first scene. It was Theseus and Hippolyta. And Theseus was played by John Lodge, who later became the governor of Connecticut. He belonged to that famous Lodge family of New England. Now, I looked at him like this. I knew that the cue for my first lines came from Theseus. So I watched him very carefully, and he was talking, and then he closed his mouth, and he looked at me expectantly, and I thought, oh, well, this is when I'm supposed to speak. And I opened my mouth, and these perfectly strange words came out. And he didn't look at all surprised, and then his mouth opened, and other words came out of his mouth, and then he closed his mouth, and then I opened my mouth, and other words came out, and nobody looked surprised, and nobody looked embarrassed or thunderstruck or horrified. And then it was time for the 4 lovers to make their exit, and we trooped down and made our exit round the rim of the stage. And there was this great round of applause. It was so surprising and so absolutely wonderful that I couldn't wait to get back on stage. And I didn't have stage fright from that moment on, and not in that performance. Now I've got to tell you what Reinhardt did with the bow. I have to tell you about that. There's that great shell that is normally present behind and sort of encompassing the stage of the Hollywood Bowl, where symphony orchestra so often plays. That great shell was slid behind an arm of mountain on railroad, on tracks, so that you couldn't see it. And on the stage, he built a hill, a great hill. And into that hill were sunk 5 different big pits. Into those 5 big pits were planted huge oak trees, 5 huge oak trees. And the whole hill was covered with grassy turf. To the left, as you're facing the stage, there was a platform, very high platform built, screened with bushes and branches. The Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra was situated there, so that when they played Mendelssohn's music, you didn't know where it was coming from. It just filled the night, but you didn't know its source. Now, there were bushes on the stage, too, the famous one with the episode of the tomato juice. Fortunately, it was there. Now, at the crest of the hill, he built a bridge right over what I think is the parking lot, and maybe even Highland Avenue. In any case, well, the parking lot, surely. he built it from the crest of the hill right over to a mountain. And he carved into that mountain a winding path that led from the other side of the hill right to the bridge. He also had the hill, this dark hill, wired so that tiny little lights like fireflies came on at the beginning of the performance, at the time when the music, mysterious music of Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream Suite began to float on the night air. Now, he engaged, as you know, Depression, 100 CC civilian something or other, construction was something or other corps, civilian construction corps, something like that, of these young people who the government was seeing to it that they had work to do and could feed themselves. So this situation was something that nobody knows about today. And you can't even imagine the state the country was in then. So I think they got $1 an hour, maybe it was $1 a night, but they were dressed in, I think, Greek togas. The whole performance was costumed in Baroque, some Baroque and some sort of Greek Baroque. But in any case, they were torchbearers, and you saw them as the music began to play and the lights flicker all over the dark mountain. Over this crest of the mountain came these torchbearers, and you saw them, the torches, 100 torches, winding down this pathway, then over the bridge, and they split and lined the sides of this great hill where the court ladies then assembled and court gentlemen, and finally Theseus and Hippolyta make their entrance, and eventually the four lovers. But that was something remarkable. That was in the tradition of European festivals, and that was the genius of Max Reinhardt. And do you know, no one knows his name today? That is so dreadful. So dreadful. Reinhardt was a very ebullient man, marvelous, and his style of direction was a very special one. He loved to act out the parts, all the parts. He loved that, and he expected you. He had obviously worked each one out. He expected you to catch his intonations, inflections, and duplicate them. So I would mark out, you know, the way, the cadence of the way he read the lines or spoke the lines, I should say. He never read anything, and try to remember them and then reproduce them and have them there for the next rehearsal. I did have a bit of trouble. I would rehearse quite carefully at the Highland Hotel. That was the name of this little hotel. But then he would get me to, you know, no, he would do it again. Let's say the next rehearsal. And I would study, and then I would do it after, and he would say, good, now keep it. And it was the keeping of it that was the problem. It was curious. I liked this. It was an interesting problem. So it was interesting to try and do it well. But you see, it was imposed direction. And in Alice in Wonderland, well, it came from here out. It was, well, I just was Alice, and so it was sort of quite different. But what I hoped to do, not necessarily as Hermia, because this direction was fascinating. I knew I was learning a lot. Was eventually to have a role which was came from inside was creatively done. I do regret it. I regret it very, very much. I think those 4 years are extremely important in university, not only for what you learn, but it gives, at least I thought that it would give me, and I think it does give all students, a chance to find out what they are best suited to. To be happy in a profession, you have to be temperamentally suited to it as well as have talent and training for it. And it is very important to be happy in the profession that you adopt or that you take up in life. I do regret that. I don't know whether this was really the profession I might have taken. I had other interests too, you know, and but anyway, life propelled me, as you have seen, into the profession. Life a necessity because of the Depression. It causes a lot of. The motion picture business is not easy. It was not easy then. It was hard, really hard, exhausting too, in every way, physically. It was a 6-day week, and Saturday night, it was the custom to ask at the end of the week, mind you, of having gotten up, the actors having gotten up at 5:30, 6 in the morning to report to makeup. Women had to report at 6:30 on the set, ready, dressed and up on your lines and ready to shoot. You would work till 6:30 at night, but 6 days a week. The custom was on Saturday night to excuse the company at 6 for dinner and come back and shoot till midnight. I can't tell you how hard that was on us and how the actors disliked doing it, and the camera crew, the grips, everyone disliked that very much. And you know what I did to get around that? Well, I suggested to the cameraman that we'd put dark circles under my eyes, that he photographed me very badly, the makeup would put, and I would show in the rushes, and he would say, "What's the matter with her appearance?" Oh, well, she was very tired, Jack, after the week, you know. And finally, they abandoned that practice. At least they did with me. I think it's terribly important for this country that the young have at least 1 year of university in some foreign country. It's extremely important to understand another culture, another people. Here we are isolated, this huge continent, isolated from the rest of the world by 2 great oceans. We don't understand other peoples. It's so ironic because we are made up of people of every race whose origins were other countries. We are almost completely ignorant. And we are rather arrogant in our ignorance, and we are going to make terrible blunders that are injurious to other peoples abroad and, in the end, to ourselves. It's imperative. Otherwise, we'll be a retrogressive nation, and we're on our way. Here's a thing that's very serious. I know three university students, that is to say, one who's going to do postgraduate work, brilliant girl, another who I think will also do postgraduate, another who's 19, who's a sophomore. The 19-year-old has a capacity for analysis, absolutely, which would be counted as brilliant in a 45-year-old woman. She can't spell. She knows her way around her laptop, and these mechanisms that spell for you. She can't spell. Didn't think it was necessary. Neither can these other two girls. Top students they were, can't spell. Now that's retrogressive. The 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, I'll bet you anything they can't add either, because they've got the calculator. Also, one of the reasons they can't spell is that they will watch television, you see, instead of reading books. They won't look at anything up in their dictionary even. It's all done by pressing buttons. Reading, think of what the brain goes through. It's a very, very special operation, function. The brain, when you read, you visualize, you imagine the characters. When you go and watch television, it's not only physically passive, well, reading is physically passive, certainly, but it's all done for you. Now, it does arouse your interest, your full attention, and your emotions, but by a different process. The other process, the capacity to envision yourself, is very important to develop. And if you do that, you are apt to learn to spell anyway, because you will see the difference between words that sound the same, like manor, M-A-N-O-R, and manner, M-A-N-N-E-R, and how they're used, how they're spelled differently. Oh, it's imperative, and I think, something has to be done to encourage them to learn to spell, to read, to add and subtract. Biographies I found fascinating. And of course I would visualize Michelangelo. And then there was someone called Steinmetz, I'm quite sure that was his name, who was a scientist of some sort. Now, can you imagine me, I had no talent for science at all, riveted by the story of Steinmetz? What other biographies riveted me? Fanny Kemble, too. And I ended up, I thought Fanny Kemble was a great British acting family in the 19th century. She came to America and she went on a lecture tour all over this country when it was just developing. I thought that so enthralling, courageous, but look at the adventures and how she learned what she learned. Well, there came a time in my life when it was suggested that I do a lecture tour, and do you know, I did what Fanny Kemble did. I had wanted to do it when I read her book, the book about her, rather, and by heaven, years later, that's what I did, and it was very reassuring. I went all over this country, was going through a very tough period, and I met nice people everywhere. Very reassuring. Any profession that really serves humanity and affects humanity for the good is in a way a sacred profession. Medical profession, the nursing profession, but also the teaching profession. A whole civilization Each civilizations are formed by teachers. Our country depends on them. Our young depend on them. Our lives depend on them. When I was very young, I was, grammar school, I was good at my studies, and I remember that George Edward Morris, he was 10, I think, 8 or 10, asked my mother if I would coach George Edward Morris every week, Saturday, in, I think it was spelling, reading, arithmetic. And my mother said yes, she thought Olivia could do that. And George Edward Morris's mother said, I will pay 25 cents an hour for this. Well, that was a huge sum. So I very happily coached George Edward Morris. I hope his spelling improved. I hope he did improve in his studies. And then when I got to high school, and after a beginning where I was full of despair and thought I would never be able to do Latin, through my mother's helping me with my homework for 2 weeks, I became quite good at it. In fact, they had to, advance a new grade. It was A+, because I was that far ahead of the other students. And to give me an A was unfair because they would have to have a B+. So this became known that I was pretty good at Latin. And Sybil Lord's mother called up my mother and said, would you let Olivia coach Sybil in Latin? And I think she was willing to pay something like 50 or 75 cents an hour for this. Oh, well, I was very happy to coach Sybil Lord in Latin. Oh, it's been an extraordinary experience. Absolutely extraordinary. To learn about another culture and other people is an immense privilege and an exciting adventure. Not only that, but just living in Europe has been an extraordinary experience because I have been living in a culture of peace. Those 19-year-old American boys, Omaha Beach and up and down that coast, they didn't die for nothing. Think of it, Europe with all these different countries, each country separate from the other in terms of history, culture, language. All of them for 2,000 years and more at war with each other, generation after generation. And all of a sudden, after World War II, they didn't want to kill each other anymore. And we now have the European Union. It's a miracle. And the culture there is indeed a culture of peace. And the thought of solving a problem, a disagreement through war, well, unthinkable. Unthinkable. I mean, really. Imagine if the United States had been created 2,000 years ago, and from then until now, Nevada had declared war on California regularly all through those centuries. Florida had been at war with Alabama, North Dakota with South Dakota, Oregon with Washington and Idaho and Montana and the rest of them, Nebraska, Mississippi, all at war with each other for 2,000 years, and suddenly one day they decide they don't want to kill each other anymore. That's what's happened in Europe. War is a very stupid way to settle a disagreement. Unthinkable. That's true. won't do. And in Europe, you have the feeling that the whole human race has been raised to another level by what has happened there. Well, Melanie, of course. Look at what she experiences in terms of life experience in that film. Great progression and development of character. And then To Each His Own. The development of character there was just marvelous. Yes, so Melanie means a great deal to me. As an acting problem, of course, Dark Mirror, but that Terry, that film is not close to my heart. I'm glad I did it, but you cannot say it's close to my heart. But there was Jodie Norris, very close to my heart in her development, and certainly Virginia Cunningham, as you well know by now, in The Snake Pit, and Catherine Sloper in The Heiress. Look what she underwent, discovering that her father did not love her and didn't even like her, and that the man she loved didn't love her either. Now, those in a woman's life are enormous experiences. I wanted to play her. Well, I'm not very familiar with it, and I suppose you would like to know how actresses of my day differ from actresses of today. Well, the actresses of today are richer.